Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to begin this event today. My name's Ian Hall. I'm the Acting Director of the Griffith Asia Institute here in Brisbane. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking today. That's the land of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I'm very delighted to introduce this very timely event, this very important event looking at China after the 20th Party Congress, which, as we're all aware, broke with precedent and allowed Xi Jinping to stay in office for a third term. We have a very distinguished panel of experts today to discuss where China is going, where it is today, but also where it is likely to go under Xi's continued leadership over the next 5 years. And I'd like to introduce them all in turn. So if you'll indulge me while I go through their biographies in turn, and then we'll go into their comments and we'll finish up with a Q&A, and I'll talk about the housekeeping for that in a moment. So first of all, we've got Rowan Kallick, who we have as an industry fellow here at the Griffith Asia Institute, who's a journalist and managed a publishing group in Papua New Guinea for 10 years. Then he migrated to Australia and served as both the Australian Financial Review's Hong Kong-based China correspondent and the Australian's Beijing-based China correspondent. And he's been widely published in other outlets. He's now an advisory board member of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations, a board member of the Australia-Taiwan Business Council. He's an honorary fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. He won 2 Walkley Awards for his journalism and a Graham Perkin Award for Australian Journalist of the Year. In 2015, he received an OBE on the recommendation of the PNG government, and he's written 3 books, each published in Chinese and English, including Party Time, Who Runs China and Now. Second, we've got Alice Su, who's joining us from Taiwan. Alice is the senior China correspondent for The Economist, based in Taipei. Before she joined The Economist, she was Beijing bureau chief for Los Angeles Times. She's won multiple awards, including most recently the Asia Society's 2021 Osborne Elliott Prize for Excellence in Journalism on Asia. Before she joined the LA Times, she spent 5 years freelancing in the Middle East and won the 2014 Elizabeth Neuffer Memorial Prize from the United Nations Correspondents Association for her coverage of the refugee crises in Jordan and Lebanon. She also won other awards for her journalism in Jordan and Tunisia and elsewhere. Alice studied public policy and Near Eastern studies at Princeton and Chinese politics and international relations at Peking University. Third, we have Richard McGregor, senior fellow for East Asia at the Lowy Institute, former Beijing and Washington bureau chief for the Financial Times. He's published multiple books. I'm sure many of you will have read them at one point or another. His most recent book, Xi Jinping, The Backlash, was published by Penguin Australia as a Lowy Institute paper in 2019. He also has published a book on Sino-Japanese relations, Asia's Reckoning, which was called Shrewd and Knowing by the Wall Street Journal, and of course, The Party in 2010 on the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party, translated to 7 languages and awarded multiple prizes. In 2018, Richard won the Prime Minister of Australia's Literary Award for Nonfiction. He's a senior associate non-resident with the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and a visiting scholar at the Wilson Center in George Washington University back in 2014, 2016. Finally, on our panel today, we've got Sue Travaskis. Sue is a professor of Chinese studies here at Griffith University, although she's speaking to us from country Victoria today. Her research has resulted in over 70 publications, including path-breaking first books in English on the criminal courts in China, policing serious crime and the death penalty in China. She's also edited a number of volumes on these and similar topics. Her current Australian Research Council project is on Chinese governance in the Xi Jinping era. Now, what we've done today is we've asked each of our speakers to address particular dimensions of China after the Party Congress and under Xi Jinping for about 8 to 10 minutes or so, and we're going to then move into Q&A. You'll be able to ask questions using the Q&A function that's on the bottom of your screen, on your Zoom screen. And what I will do is curate and then ask those questions to the panel. Please indicate when you're asking a question which person you'd like to address, whether it's the entire panel or whether it's a member of the panel in particular. And I will try my best to curate and pose those questions in the Q&A section, which will follow the initial comments. So I'd like to go first of all to Rowan Kallick, and Rowan is going to provide us with some comments on where China goes now with the rest of the world. What does Xi Jinping's third term imply for China's foreign policy, its relations with the region? Something highly topical as we see Xi for the first time outside of China at the G20 and in the summits that go on at this particular time in Asia's summit season. So Rowan, let's come to you first, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Ian, and good day, everyone, wherever you are. The former Foreign Minister Chen Qichen once explained pithily that for the People's Republic of China, foreign policy is the extension of domestic policy. We can see that clearly laid out in the work report delivered a month ago by the Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary Xi Jinping to its 20th Congress. He said near the start of the report, 63 pages in the English version and easily downloadable, everyone should read it, that confronted with drastic changes in the international landscape, especially external attempts to blackmail, contain, blockade, and exert maximum pressure on China, we put our national interests first, focused on internal political concerns. So when we seek to identify threads in PRC foreign policy and practice, we need to consider carefully the prime goals of the party, which others will consider more closely during our discussion today. In that work report, Xi also said that the world has entered a new period of turbulence and change. A backlash against globalization is rising. The global economy is sluggish. The hegemonic, high-handed, and bullying acts of using strength to intimidate the weak, taking from others by force and subterfuge, and playing zero-sum games are exerting grave harm. External efforts to suppress and contain China may escalate at any time, as may various Black Swan and Grey Rhino events. We will crack down hard on infiltration, sabotage, subversion, and separatist activities by hostile forces. We will become more adept at deploying our military forces on a regular basis and in diversified ways. The world has once again reached a crossroads in history. So those are all quotes from the work report. So with such alarm bells ringing in the ears and in his ears, now also those of his 97 million party comrades, Xi delivered his prescription for calming their anxieties. More of the same, especially more of him. Xi seems set to continue for another 10 years until 2032 at least. And the core Congress message was clear. The world is turning so sour, we require a stern and ideologically robust helmsman to steer party and country safely for a further generation. Our course is correct, but we're surrounded by troublemakers orchestrated by Washington. This marks a shift in locating the party's core legitimacy, not so much in the now fading economy, but in the international realm, in safeguarding the party and country from hostile forces and expanding its benevolent influence. An official report noted that in choosing the party's new leadership team, some were assessed according to quotes, whether they were brave and good at fighting against the US and Western sanctions and safeguarding national security, close quotes. That Xi's new era is also now that of peak party as it enters its second century, and I believe of peak economy for China, reinforces Xi's need to speed efforts to ensure the world becomes safe for the party while it still retains the leverage, especially by weaponizing its economic ubiquity to get results. Xi proclaimed, "We've shown a fighting spirit." And since the report of the former ambassador to Australia, Ma Jiaoshu, now a vice foreign minister, has reinforced the need to evince that fighting spirit also externally, as directed by Xi Jinping thought on diplomacy. The new champion of this Xi diplomacy will be Wang Yi, appointed to the Politburo, although aged 69. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs Party Secretary, Qi Yu, widely credited with driving the diplomat's new fighting spirit, has been appointed to the party Central Committee, as has US Ambassador Qin Gang, formerly Xi's protocol chief, who is expected to become new foreign minister, while Liu Jianqiao now heads the party's international liaison department. Both Qin and Liu are well known to international journalists from their time as government spokesman. Last year, Xi launched his global development and security initiatives, kind of hinged off his Belt and Road Initiative, whose geopolitical success has been considerable, despite becoming something of a debt trap for Chinese banks, which are also now tasked with trying to pump life back into the Chinese economy. Since the Congress, Xi has sought to double down on China's surge towards global power. This has long been a CCP modus operandi, pushing swiftly after important meetings have consolidated its domestic grip to make the wider world safe for itself. But it now comprises an almost existential mission as the party seeks, in Xi's work report words, to ensure security in the pursuit of development. Global and national goals are integrated in a new way. Quotes, "Today our world, our times and history are changing in ways like never before. The world has once again reached a crossroad in history, and its future course will be decided by all the world's peoples." Close quotes. Thus the need to, quotes again, accelerate the development of China's discourse and narrative systems to better tell China's stories, to make China's voice heard, close quotes, and to become even more actively involved in setting global security rules, in reforming the global governance system. The leaders of Germany, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Tanzania rushed to Beijing to greet Xi immediately after the Congress, showing, said Global Times, that more and more countries are optimistic about China's future development. Close quotes. This rush also revealed which countries and leaders seem most anxious about their own futures and most eager to solicit special favors from Beijing. Xi told German Chancellor Olaf Scholz that their nations should not unite for peace in a chaotic world. Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan did a bit better, signing 15 agreements. Tanzania is the locus of the first Central Party school in Africa, built with $40 million from the party and 120 cadres from 6 parties that have ruled their African countries continuously since independence have recently participated in the first training module there, led by the CCP's International Liaison Department. The Hong Kong leadership appointed by Beijing this year excitedly hosted a fortnight ago a global financial leaders investment summit, where such leaders queued to praise the alleged great re-emerging opportunities to get rich in and from Hong Kong and Beijing. The UBS chairman, Colm Kelleher, pledged, "We're all very pro-China." It was no surprise that investment bank guesswork about the lifting of zero COVID constraints early next year prompted a stock market uptick. Xi himself suddenly started traveling overseas again for the first time since the start of 2020, when COVID had hit. Immediately before the Congress and after its program was bedded down, he flew to Kazakhstan, then to Uzbekistan for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit there. And this week he has, of course, been in Bali for the G20, and tomorrow will be at the APEC summit in Bangkok. Despite claims that Beijing has been distancing itself from Russia, it's difficult to see evidence beyond Xi's uncontroversial public request that nuclear weapons not be used over Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, who signed with Xi the No Limits Pact between Russia and China in February, reaffirmed on October the 27th that Xi has called me his friend and I consider him as such. and noted that relations between the countries, quotes, have reached an unprecedented level of openness, mutual trust, and effectiveness, close quotes, especially in military technology. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Wang Wenbin responded that we highly appreciate the positive remarks by President Putin. Faced with a world of change and disorder, China-Russia relations have maintained the momentum of robust development. I don't think we can see much change coming there. Xi met Joe Biden for 3 hours in Bali on Tuesday, where both sides appeared to wish to manage the inevitable competition before it could degenerate into conflict. Danny Russell, who ran East Asia and the Pacific under Obama, described it as a deliberate effort to stabilize a dangerously overheated relationship. Russell claimed that in Bali, the two leaders have been getting an earful on their need to avoid conflict and to help, not hinder, on the big global challenges of the day, close quotes, like climate change, slowing global economy, and so on. Every country on earth must find a way to live alongside China, preferably beneficially and as far as can be ensured safely, but it's getting more difficult to do so while retaining full sovereignty, since the party believes its security can only ultimately be guaranteed by restraining other sovereignty, especially in this region. So countries have to hedge. The big question is whether to hedge closer to Beijing or to Washington. Xi said in his work report, "Let us harness our indomitable fighting spirit to open up new horizons for our cause." We all know where China is intending to head for the next 10 years at least, even more deeply, more fervently into Xi country, whose horizons sometimes appear boundless, sometimes constrained, especially by painful economic realities that require such stabilizing events as this week's meetings with Biden and with Australia's own Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Thanks for listening to me. And I look forward to hearing everyone else, of course.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rowan. That was a wonderful overview of, if you like, Xi's, I suppose, 10-year mission to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party, echoing that kind of Wilsonian mission back at the beginning of the 20th century. I'm going to turn now to Alice. Alice, I think we're going to get you to speak about what these changes and continuities, if you like, imply for Chinese society, for zero COVID, and a whole range of issues like ideology, demographics, and so on. But I'm also going to ask you to, given that you are sitting there in Taiwan, to comment a little bit also on the Taiwan question as well, please. So over to you, Alice.
Thank you, Ian. So I have a whole range of topics to cover. I thought a good way to get into this, what did the Party Congress mean for Chinese society and for ordinary Chinese people, if you will, was to start with ideology and to start with how Xi himself and the party leaders around him framed what has been going on in China in the last 10 years. And you can see that when you read his work report to the Party Congress. So right at the top, there's actually, I find it very interesting and helpful, a clear explanation of how he talks about how 10 years ago, the party, essentially the Communist Party in China were in crisis. And there's a whole list of problems coming from Xi Jinping's perspective and coming from the party leader's perspective. They say, leadership was weak, hollowed, and watered down. There was wavering political conviction, widespread corruption, economic imbalances. Chinese laws were not enforced or totally ignored. And in Chinese society, there were widespread, quote, misguided patterns of thinking, such as money worship, hedonism, egocentricity, historical nihilism. Hong Kong was not stable. And so kind of, if you look at things from the perspective of the party leadership 10 years ago, if you rewind the clock 10 years, maybe from a lot of Western observers' view, China was, on a path of opening up, and many Western leaders and scholars and journalists had this view of engagement is going to change China eventually. But from the party's view, no, there was crisis. The party was weak. People didn't really believe in party ideology. University students were attending their required Marxism classes, but nobody really believed in that, right? And so the solution to this crisis and lack of control was, well, the solution was Xi Jinping and Xi Jinping thought. And that, I think the major takeaway from the party congress is it's not anything surprising to me, but it's an affirmation of what we've been seeing in the last few years, which is this strong assertion that what was needed in China was control. And Xi Jinping thought at its essence is it's an ideology, but really what it's, well, I guess some other people will talk more about this, but its core is that the party needs to be the party needs to be disciplined. We need to purge, the corruption and the lack of dedication and the selfishness and so on in the party. We need to do constant self-reform. And then the party needs to have control over every area of life in China. And so for the ordinary Chinese person, what that has looked like is just a much more obvious daily sense of the party's presence in your life, in every field of life. So in media, in entertainment, in schools and education, in the private sector, the party once again is playing a leading role. And so I think what we can expect coming out of the Congress and into Xi's third term is more of that. And kind of echoing what Rowan said, there is this clear perception that the world is changing, it's unstable, and we need security, and we need to get ready to struggle and fight. So that, and I was in Beijing the last few years, and I went to so many of these kind of his special exhibits to celebrate different anniversaries, the anniversary of the Korean War, which they call the war against American aggression, and so on. And everywhere you go, there's this, or the 100th anniversary of the party, and everywhere you go, there is this call to follow the party and struggle, bring back struggle, bring back this sense of you are Chinese, you should be proud to be Chinese, and you should be proud that the party made China great, and you should stop criticizing all the things that happened in the past and under Mao. That's historical nihilism. Now we need to unite and realize that all our greatness comes from party leadership under Xi Jinping. You also need to start reporting on your neighbors if they are being historical nihilists. You can call hotlines to report on them. So there's this much more greater sense of just let's get together under this mission. Let's make China great. But also watch out if you are not on board with this mission, right? So we've seen a great increase in censorship, in repression, in like free speech was never really there in China, but in the last few years, the level of punishment for critical speech has just escalated so much. Even in the last few weeks, like one report I was looking at, there's a huge COVID lockdown going on in Xinjiang right now. It's been going on for more than 3 months. And there were several people who were arrested, not because they were protesting, not because they were challenging party authority, but simply because they were commenting on live streams of Chinese National Health Commission press conferences where, the health authorities were talking about an adjustment to COVID policies. And then people desperate under lockdown in Xinjiang were kind of spamming the comment section, right? Saying, Urumqi, 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 like, please pay attention to Urumqi. And they were arrested for that. So, you can get a sense of just how little space there is now for speech in China. And I think we can expect more of the same. And, when Xi Jinping is all about order, discipline, and security, and that's not only security in the sense of, strengthening the military. It's not just security in the sense of defense. It's also ideological security, so kind of purging China of Western ideas like civil society or accountable government, checks and balances, separation of powers, purging China of all those ideas, making sure that people, don't believe in, in their words, kind of Western models of modernization, but they believe in the Chinese model, which just means following the party. And then also national security. So a very tight grip on any potential threats to social stability. And that also means more restrictions on petitioners. It means, and I think Sue might talk more about this later, so I'll move on from that. But that's the overall view, I think, is we'll have more of the same, of this very intensely controlled. And it's not, and to me, the thing is, it's not just about there's more top-down party control and there's more censorship and so on, but it's also that every Chinese person is expected to it's not just that you have to comply and obey, you have to also fight. You're expected to have more of this struggling spirit. And, but it's, well, we can also talk about this later, how effective is that really, right? Because in the last few years, there's this poverty alleviation campaign, for example, and you see kind of the grassroots officials going into the villages and, moving people around. And then you see Xi Jinping slogans all over the building saying like, let's, struggle and fight. But then when you talk to the actual people who are being affected by those campaigns, mostly they have a very passive attitude of, I didn't ask for this, I didn't ask to be moved, now I'm moved, but anyway, my life is hard, I'm a migrant worker, I'm trying to survive. They're not really, a lot of, I think many Chinese people are not really buying into this struggle spirit, especially young people who are, very burnt out, tired, and have started all these Chinese slang terms like lying flat, lying flat, or letting, how do you translate this? It's like letting it rot, letting yourself rot, because they just feel there's no way to get, to compete in this rat race. So anyway, okay, sorry, that's a lot about Chinese society. I didn't want to talk about COVID because I think coming into the 20th Party Congress, a lot of us, journalists and China watchers, we're very focused on the elite politics and the ideology and what that means. But for ordinary Chinese people, what they cared about the most was, this big question, like, is there going to be a loosening of zero COVID? Because over the last few years, that is what has really affected and changed, really tightened the space that people have in their daily lives. And COVID actually was not really mentioned at the 20th Party Congress itself, but I think you can see clear signs on. Well, but first there's clear messaging coming from the central government, and then secondly there are clear signs, and I think the most obvious one is the appointment of Li Qiang, the Shanghai Party secretary, to the Standing Bureau, and I think that is something that there was a lot of speculation about, and journalists were. We're kind of like, okay, the Wall Street Journal is so confident, but do they really know? Like, that would be crazy, because they would upend all these historical norms of how much experience you're meant to have before you get a position like that. But that did happen, and Xi appointed he appointed all these people who are have these close connections to him. But I think the Shanghai Party secretary's appointment, it was a clear signal that what matters now in everything, but also in implementing COVID policy is loyalty to the top, and loyalty to Xi himself. And for those of us who covered the Shanghai lockdown, or have many friends and family who lived through the Shanghai lockdown, it's shocking, because on the one hand, from the perspective of some people who experienced it, it was a total disaster, right? There were so many, there was food shortage, there was confusion, there were so many unnecessary secondary deaths that happened, not because of COVID, but deaths because people couldn't receive medical care due to COVID restrictions. And it's tragic and awful that is still happening. It's a little bit more understandable that it happened back in Wuhan when COVID was new, but the fact that it's still happening and it's repeating over and over again with every zero COVID lockdown in China, I think that is just really shocking. And I think it's sad that it's happened so much that a lot of us have become numb to it. Even when we're reporting, we feel like, oh, okay, another death, another. But I think that what we can take away from the fact that the person in charge of the city that went through that lockdown was rewarded and elevated to a higher position of power, it shows that kind of what Xi Jinping values is officials who have the fighting spirit, who have the loyalty, and who will do what the party core leadership says, no matter what, even if they have a city full of very angry Shanghainese being very loud and vocal and saying, you're destroying our lives, you're destroying our city. But that's not what matters. What matters what matters is not what the ordinary people are saying or their experience. What matters is that you stick to the party line. And so zero COVID, I think it's very clear that zero COVID now is no longer about science or public health. It is a political strategy, and it has become so tied together with the Communist Party's claims of systemic superiority, right? They've talked about how, we protect our people, we have these low death numbers, and the way we do things, it shows that we're superior, and it also shows that Xi Jinping himself personally, is our amazing leader, and so that makes it very hard to shift and to change. And I think what's interesting now is we do see some adjustments to COVID policies, and we're still trying to figure this out, because it was only last week that the State Council announced a list of 20 kind of optimization adjustments to zero COVID. So for example, no longer isolating contacts of cases, but just only the first level of contacts, or stop, not identifying medium risk areas, only having high and low. So you can see that there is an attempt to make adjustments, but I think it is. But it is hard to say. So it's hard to say if that means there's going to be an actual overall loosening or not, or if it's just an attempt to say we're going to keep zero COVID, and we're going to keep saying we want to wipe out COVID from China. We don't want it to come at all. And we're just trying to figure out ways to make it more sustainable. I think the experience on the ground, I'm not there, I'm in Taiwan, but a lot of my colleagues are in Beijing, and they're just telling me it's been very chaotic this week because, for example, in Chaoyang district of Beijing, they removed many of the testing booths because they said, we don't want to do so much mass testing anymore. But then the buildings, the malls and the office buildings were still requiring negative results. So then what you got was just hours long, huge lines of people still having to test. And I think what we're watching to see now, there are a few things that we're watching in order to evaluate what's happening. One is, as case numbers grow, especially in the next week, will the Chinese government be okay with that and be able to live with the higher numbers? Or will they say, actually, no, this is going out of control, let's do the lockdowns? Will they? Because that's kind of what happened in Shanghai as well. Initially, there was some attempt to experiment and nuance the strategy, and then the numbers started growing, and then the central government came in and said, lockdown, stop the spread. So we're waiting to see if that happens, and we're also looking for certain signs. If China is really going to shift out of this strategy, then they need to change the propaganda messaging. They need to start telling Chinese people the virus can be lived with. It's not that serious. If you're vaccinated, you can, we can live with it essentially, and rather than what they have now, which is, it's a disaster and it's terrible and it's scary, and the West doesn't care about human life. That's why they've let all these people get sick. And they also need to ramp up vaccinations. They need to potentially get mRNA vaccines, which China still doesn't have. And after Olaf Scholz went to China, there was an announcement that mRNA vaccines could be made possible for foreigners in China in the near future, but that in itself is not going to address the larger problem of very low immunity in the Chinese population. And they need to also ramp up availability of ICU space and hospital space across all of China. And I think a lot of people initially were saying, China has to do zero COVID because their hospital system just isn't strong enough, and it would take so much time to create that capacity. But I would argue that now it's been almost 3 years, like there has been time, so why isn't there an effort to create that hospital space? So anyway, we're looking for those signs, and if those signs appear, then it will show that there is a real movement. But for now, I think what we see is just adjustment and not necessarily a real shift in direction to loosening. And then finally, I'm sorry, I don't know if I went over, I probably went over time. It's okay. But I'll just finish on Taiwan. On Taiwan, I think that, again, well, Taiwan is interesting. It was the one part from my colleagues who were in the Great Hall of the People. They said, that was the one part of Xi's speech that got a big response. People were like, oh yeah, and even I remember when Xi made his speech for the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. Also, whenever he's talked about, when he's got to the Taiwan section, that's always a section that people cheer. People are like, yeah, this is what's going to show that we are truly a great rejuvenated China. I would say that he didn't really say anything new at the 20th Party Congress. It's kind of all the same things as before. We want peaceful reunification, but we will not renounce the use of force. But I do think that it's clear that Xi Jinping is serious about Taiwan, and you can see that not about wanting to take Taiwan. You can see that not only from the way he spoke about it at the Congress, but also in his meeting with Biden this week, right? He said, Taiwan is the core of China's core interests. This is the red line, like don't interfere with Taiwan. But, thankfully, from my perspective, the US also is not backing down on Taiwan. So this is the core issue that cannot be resolved. And so far, we're all just trying to find ways to reduce risk of conflict. I do think, we have seen a lot of messaging coming from American officials talking about a shortened timeline and saying maybe Xi wants to act by 2027, which is actually a deadline for military modernization, or maybe even sooner. I don't know where they are getting that information from. And I also don't know if they're giving that messaging as a way to deter or to show that America is ready to act, or if it's truly based on some kind of intelligence. I would say though that there is a deadline. The deadline to me there is definitely a deadline, which is 2049. The deadline for the second centenary goal, because China has already achieved the first goal of being a moderately prosperous nation, and then by the mid-century they want to be a great modern socialist nation. And Xi said at the Congress that taking Taiwan or resolving the Taiwan question is a natural requirement for realizing the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So it's clear that he sees it as key to achieving, Chinese greatness and bringing China back to where it's meant to be. But as for when he's going to act, it's hard to say. I think you can say that. I think what we can see for sure is that he's preparing the Chinese military. And Xi Jinping recently visited the Central Military Commission to tell them again about having the fighting spirit and being prepared to fight. But aside from words aside, you've seen that he's centralized power over the military, and that he's purged potential disloyal or discontent actors from within the military, and he's invested quite a lot in modernization and in strengthening the PLA. And you can also see from Xi's actions on his emphasis on food security and on technological self-sufficiency, that I think China is looking at what has happened to Russia in the last year. They're looking at the impact of Western sanctions. And I think even before this, China was thinking about how to be self-sufficient in case, because they see that a struggle is coming and a conflict with the US is coming. So they want to make sure that they address all the choke points that the West could use against them. But I think after seeing what's happened to Russia this year, that has accelerated the urgency in the Communist Party leader's view, the importance of self-reliance. And I think that actually is very interesting. And then that I think is where the Biden administration has hit China where it hurts with the export controls on the semiconductor industry. And it's very interesting that we haven't yet seen a strong response from China on that, maybe because well, I don't know. We can discuss that. Why hasn't there been a response? Is it because they just don't want to escalate, or there isn't much they can do about it, or is it that Xi, especially with this new his new kind of flurry of diplomacy at the G20, is he trying to stabilize things because he realizes that China is getting so unstable with the economy hurt by COVID and everything that we've mentioned. So yeah. So I mean my final point on Taiwan is just. I think Xi Jinping definitely wants to act. We don't know when, but I think it is wise and correct for the rest of the world, for Taiwan and the rest of the world, to be thinking about deterrence and doing everything they can to deter that action. Okay, so I will stop here and we can go on.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alice. We asked you to cover an enormous amount of ground and you did so expertly. And I'm really glad as well that you brought us back in terms of the discussion of the zero COVID policy. You brought us back to this question about the systemic superiority idea, which was so core to the way that China presented itself in 2020 and early 2021, and which I, to be honest with I had kind of forgotten about to a degree. So it's good. I'm really glad to have come back to that. And also it leads very nicely into Richard and talking about what she's third term is going to imply for the government of China, the party succession issues, and so on. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alice. I suspect the hotline on historical nihilism is going to get a heavy workout after your speech, but it might affect all of us. Now, Ian, you asked me to speak about the party and the government, so I'm going to, partly because it's much better looking than me, I'm going to try and show a few slides. Now, some of these slides for the experts on this panel and maybe some people watching is kind of China 101, but one of the biggest issues in trying to explain China to a intelligent lay audience is about the separation between the party and the government, the different functions of the party and the government, and of course under Xi the narrowing of the distinction between the party and the government. But let me, so I've got a slideshow which I'm showing in various places, and let's see, can you see that? Yep. Okay, let me see if here we go. So first of all, and this is pretty basic, but the idea of the party and the government being separate really comes post-Mao. We have the pre-Mao era, the post-Mao era. And Deng Xiaoping, in the Mao era was chaotic, anarchic, many thousands of millions or however, people died in the Cultural Revolution. We had the Great Famine, the purges and the like. And so Deng Xiaoping is best remembered for his market economic reforms, but he also tried to set a new political template for China, which frankly lasted for a number of years. And, now Deng, of course, was a little hypocritical. He was really trying to wind back the room for another Mao, another dictator to emerge. Of course, he had to allow himself the room to do that. But Deng chose Jiang Zemin as the leader. He chose Hu Jintao as the leader. So Xi Jinping is unique in that respect. He's the first leader in the post-Mao era who was not chosen by Deng Xiaoping. But let's have a look at the rules that Deng laid down for elite Chinese politics in a famous speech in 1980. And of course, we do say elite politics in China because only the elite can practice it. So what are those rules? They make pretty interesting reading these days. It's not good to have an over-concentration of power. Don't have somebody with too many posts. It's distinguished between the party and the government and solve the problem of succession in the leadership. Now, we are a long way from that today, and as I'll illustrate for you in a second. But just let me talk about the last one, the problem of succession. As many of us would know, many authoritarian countries have always struggled with how to have peaceful handovers of power. In China, they manage that. Now, often when Western analysts talk about China, they say there's no political reform in China. And really what they mean by that is that China is not reforming into a Western-style democracy. But from the purely Communist Party perspective, there was enormous political reform along the lines of these principles. And the most important of them was the sort of incremental institutionalization of rules surrounding the top leadership, age limits and the like, term limits, but most importantly, a term limit for the very top leader. And they did that by having term limits for the president. Once the president and the party secretary were the same person, that effectively meant that there was a term limit on the party secretary as well. So as we all know, under Xi Jinping, he has basically thrown that out. Now, Xi has many critics and enemies, and I would say that the thing that most binds them together is the fact that he has thrown this out and thrown the succession plan, any succession planning out the window. As far as we know, Xi Jinping will be in charge of China for the next 5 or 10 years or however many years. So that was Deng's rules for Chinese politics. How do we describe Xi Jinping's rules? And here they are here: collective leadership, one-man rule, term limits, leader for life, meritocracy, loyalty. Oh, I want to pause it there. Now, none of these are absolute. Certainly it's true collective leadership has gone to one-man rule, term limits, leader for life, that's true. Meritocracy to loyalty. Alice spoke a little bit about this. There is still a meritocratic streak in the Chinese system. People are meant to perform. They have KPIs and the like. There's performance indicators. But if you look at the very top, the Politburo Standing Committee for the first time has no factional or personality-based balancing at all. Every one of those 7 members on the Standing Committee are loyalists to Xi. Now, when I say loyalists, I don't mean they are total cronies. You know, people like Li Chang, the party secretary in Shanghai, who's likely to be the next premier, he's a very experienced official, you know, an uber technocrat. He's the person who's responsible for bringing Tesla to Shanghai and gifting China the entire ecosystem of the most successful electric vehicle company in the world. So he's not a dummy, he's not a mere crony. But if there's a contest, for example, as there was effectively for the premier's job between Wang Yang, linked to, if not indelibly tied to, the China Youth League, and Li Chang, who is a former secretary of Xi Jinping, then the loyalist wins every time. Similarly, with the private sector to the state sector, China's private sector is not dead. Certainly it's wounded after the campaign waged by Xi Jinping, particularly against the tech companies in recent years. But the private sector is responsible for 60%, maybe more, of China's economic output. The party will rely on it whatever happens. In fact, it's going to be one of the very interesting pressure points in policy making in the next 5 years. You know, China is facing a secular economic downturn. In other words, you can't grow 10% every year forever. It's got a cyclical downturn, in part, large part driven by the damaged property sector. And, you know, that will never go back to what it was. It has got headwinds from a slowing global economy, as every economy does around the world. That feeds on itself. So the appetite for Chinese exports is unlikely to grow rapidly. And of course, the economy is being hit on the head at the moment by COVID zero policies and lockdowns, which might even be extending to, you know, the workshop of the world in Guangdong and Shenzhen near Hong Kong. So the private sector is not dead, but it is suffering. And there's no doubt that Xi favors a kind of hybrid economy. You know, he wants the private sector to be more like the state sector. He wants the state sector to be more like the private sector. And then we come to the next feature, wealth to common prosperity. In other words, an end to barbaric capitalism, as they called it in China, and an attack on inequality. Now, the latter aim is, of course, commendable. That China's got a lot of work to do in that area. I think the Gini coefficient in China and Asia is the most unequal, along with Nepal, last time I looked. Xi Jinping might, with good reason, look at the Trump phenomenon in America, in which pent-up anger about the so-called elites and inequality and the like, and job losses really boiled over and was tapped into by Trump and really delivered him the White House. They might look at the chaos in America and think, well, that's a bad sort of thing that we want here. But to get to a more equal, less unequal society, you know, China has to have a tremendous overhaul of its fiscal system, its tax system. I think about 5% of central government revenues in China come from personal taxes. And so until you can change that, let alone putting, you know, a central provincial fiscal relations on a more sound footing, it's very difficult to attack. So that's going to be another big task. Globalization, technological independence, I think Alice talked about that a little bit. China sees America leveraging its technology against China. China wants to be able to leverage its technology against the US, its allies, and any other countries that push back against it. And then, of course, we have the US coexistence, US confrontation, which is going to be a feature of our world, I would say, for some time, no matter how well the Biden-Xi meeting went in Bali. So let's push forward slightly. Now, just to illustrate this point, now once again, this is 101. for everybody on this call, but this is my graph to try and illustrate the difference between the party and the government. The National People's Congress, the crypto legislature, is parliament, the state councils are cabinet. China has ministries like every other country, but the party sits above the government and in fact sits above the law. China has a sort of, a developing sort of, body of administrative law, people suing the government, but you cannot sue the party. But the big trend, and now I'm going to come out of the slideshow there. Okay, I'm back. Good. So just to expand on some of those points, the distinction between the party and the government was, Deng's idea of pushing back against Mao. It was also Deng's idea of getting a better and less overtly politicized execution of government policies. In other words, the party sets government policy, government departments execute it. And this was seen as a more efficient way of getting things done. But with the return of the party to the center of everything in China, east, south, north, west, and all that, as Xi Jinping said, the party leads everything. The distinction between the party and the government has been played down and in fact dismissed. Wang Qishan, who was kind of the 8th member of the Standing Committee from 2017 to 2022, basically said it was no longer relevant. So what does that mean in terms of current level policy making? Let's look at the economy and go back to what we talked about in terms of the private sector. One of the, China has not been for many, many years very open place to debate politics or political reform, let alone the Communist Party or alternatives to it or top leaders. The area that has been very open to debate in China has been the economy. The merits of the market versus the state, privatization, which sectors could be open to more private capital and the like. With Xi in such total command, you see much less of that these days. You talk to Chinese economists, they're much less willing to be quoted as criticizing the current direction of China and the more statist direction of Xi Jinping and the like. So the vitality of that debate, at least in public, has been lost. And, but it's more than that. It's the question as to whether, not only whether that debate has died in public, but also whether that debate and other policy debates have died behind closed doors. Chinese politics is a black box. It's always wise to be humble about one's knowledge about it. I was reminded of this during the Hu Jintao incident in the party congress, when the former party secretary was rather brusquely and bewilderedly led off stage while all his former comrades stared obliquely in front of him. And, so Chinese politics is a black box. That was one occasion we kind of had the black box live on TV, and even then we didn't quite realize what was happening. So, a caveat to all my comments, but so the issue is, the vitality of that economic debate is dying in public. Has it died behind closed doors? To the bigger question, are there people inside the system in China who are willing to tell Xi news that he doesn't want to hear? Are they willing to, in a sustained sense, push back in policy making, not just maybe meekly suggest another way at one point or another time, but harness their ministries, harness their networks, even use the media to push alternative views? Because I don't think there's anybody on the planet who will tell you that one single person and his coterie is all wise. Everybody makes mistakes. China's made a couple of whoppers in recent years. Now, is that because Xi is closed to advice? Is that because the policy-making process is calcifying? And the old ways in which you could experiment with all sorts of policies in China, has that all gone? So I think in terms of the party, and of course, does the merging of the party and the government which we've seen in the way the expansion of the supervision department, aligning with the discipline inspection commission and the like. So does the expanded role of the party in companies, public and private, also put a quell on debate? Because as Alice talked about, there is an absolute focus on personal and ideological loyalty. I'm waiting to see signs of that happening in practice, and I'm also waiting to see signs of people pushing back against Xi on different issues. And I think the economy and the private sector is an area where you are most likely to see that. I've probably gone over time as well, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. I suspect that we're going to pick up on a lot of the things that you've said there in questions and comments and so on. And I suspect also this question about the extent to which the system is now open to alternative views is something that we've got to talk about a little bit further. But I'm going to pass now on to Sue Travaskis, and Sue is going to go back a little bit, touch on some of the things I think that Alice was talking about before, about Chinese society, but also about some of the other developments that we saw in Chinese society over the last 10 to 20 years or so. The attempt to try and bring about not rule of law, but rule by law, but then alongside that and following that, the generation of this kind of technological surveillance state and so on. So Sue, over to you about law and order and about how China is governed.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Look, I'd like to start just to acknowledging that what I'm about to say today is the product of two different and ongoing research projects on social governance that I'm currently conducting with two collaborators. One is Ozma Burnett at Griffith University, who is an expert in Chinese surveillance, and the other is with Delia Lin at the University of Melbourne, who's an expert in political discourse. So, and also what I'm about to say is also very much building on what the other three speakers have said today, particularly on ideology and political discourse. Okay, so I'll start now. Okay, so we've heard that Xi Jinping's 20th Congress report has been stressing security, 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 and more security. And that's because Xi Jinping can't actually fulfill any of his visions of the China dream without comprehensive securitization of everything. So as far back as 2013, a whole decade ago, Xi Jinping recognized this, but making domestic security equally important to international security. And he did this through what they call an overall or comprehensive national security outlook strategy. So Xi Jinping believes that he now has the solution to the perennial problem of political and social instability. Or if you've been following things over the last decade or more in China, that's very much a central theme of Chinese politics: the fear of social instability and what that can do to political instability. So I'm going to talk about this solution, which has involved the construction of what the party calls a peaceful and secure China, or in Chinese it's called 平安中国. Okay, 平安meaning secure or peaceful and secure. 平安中国. So I'm not actually going to talk about the 20th Party Congress itself, but rather some points from different recent party congresses over the last decade that Xi and colleagues believe will bring about a lasting 平安中国 or peaceful and secure China. So let me start by just throwing some words at you. One is in 2013 at a party congress. The first phrase is social governance. Now this term took over from a previous Hu Jintao era term called social management. So it moved from social management to social governance. Another term that came up, which is incredibly important, is called modernizing governance capacity. So we just keep those two things in mind. Party congresses after that, these words kept coming up and they kept getting developed and expanded upon. Okay, so by the time we got to 2017, there was this idea of speeding up the formation of a scientific and effective social governance system. By 2019, the whole party congress was about the modernization of national governance, and the building of governance capacity and accelerating it. So that was actually the title of the Congress decision. Okay, so I'll come back to some of these details of recent plenums a little later, but for now I just want to talk about or just underline the idea that party congresses have annual plenums that produce a decision, a 决定. And these 决定 introduce new catchphrases upon which all other party and government decisions hang. And so we can think of these catchphrases as ideological coat hangers upon which major policies and programs hang their rationales. Okay, so they're very important. If you want to produce a regulation, if you want to produce a law, it goes back to these catchphrases. So in the Xi Jinping era, when we look back these 10 years of plenums, we can interpret certain party catchphrases that are used as, well, what you could call stability proofing, building blocks, that if you line them up together, they start to make sense in terms of a grand vision of law and governance that Xi Jinping hopes will bring about his vision for a peaceful and safe China. So I've been following party Congress decisions for a number of years, hoping to understand what is it that Xi Jinping's grand vision for the area I study is, and that is law and social governance. It wasn't until I read a quote from the veteran American China scholar, whose name is Wu Guoguang, that things started making sense to me. And I knew that the party's end goal is to actualize the China dream of national rejuvenation. We all know that. So I got to thinking about this. So in 2013, that was the first plenum where Xi Jinping shared his ideological wares, where he introduced this idea of social governance and modernizing governance capacity as two key themes. And as I said before, these themes started expanding until you get to 2019, where it's accelerate, hurry up, speed up. Okay, so according to Wu Guoguang, Xi Jinping was said to have chosen that modernization of governance capacity as his title for the decision at the 19th Party Congress in 2019, because he believes it to be an institutional guarantee for actualizing the China dream. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So what is social governance then? Social governance is this multifaceted approach to creating a new social environment of harmony and stability across China. Now, it includes a wide range of measures, but mainly three things. First, measures to improve social service provisions. I'll give an example, establishing psychological welfare services down at the grassroots, especially in the last couple of years because of COVID, or establishing mediation centres. So that's the first aspect of social governance. The second aspect is to socially engineer moral behaviour and moral governance, so 德治. And the third is to protect against social and political instability, and that's very much in the realm of what the stability maintenance regime was a decade ago. So together, these three imperatives work together, and they aim to build a particular type of society that's instability free. Okay, so how does this modernizing governance capacity fit in with the China dream then? Well, in short, it's to improve the mechanisms of governance that allow the party to shape a society that's largely homogenous and free from insecurity. Okay, so if you've got a very pluralistic and heterogeneous society, then you're not going to be able to guarantee instability. So to tackle this problem of an increasingly pluralistic and heterogeneous society, the party is attempting to make society more homogenous by harmonizing social relations through those three initiatives I've just talked about. And so in the area of social governance, harmonizing relations means attempting to mold a certain way of thinking about China, about the party, about one's own individual role in making sure that they're doing their part to create and maintain stability and harmony. Okay, so when did this kind of start tipping over into this? So I think it was around between 2014 and 2017. After 2014, the party started talking about security first governance. You know, security comes before the economy type discourse. And Xi Jinping made this assertion that national security and social stability are the prerequisites for reform, economic reform and development. Okay, so that's a real clue. And that national security is top priority, and that national security is an important cornerstone for the stability of the country. Also, in more recent times, there's been a converging of national security and political security. Political security means political regime security. So there's a lot of social discourse there that's been expanded in the last couple of, a lot of political discourse that's been expanded there in the last couple of years. Okay, so however, the idea of making political security the number one, Ping An Zhongguo, which is peaceful and secure China priority, did not really proliferate until around 2017, when Trump started making trouble for China. When Xi Jinping put forward this basic idea that taking political security as the foundation and improving the national security system in the 19th Party Congress report. Okay, so what kind of mechanisms then need to be put in place for this institutional guarantee for actualizing the Chinese dream? So let me talk about those. So over the last decade, the party's been really has been expanding its governance capacity by building up physical and digital controls that monitor and have the capacity to shape people's thinking and movements. The party's been doing this through a huge social control engineering program, and they're calling it Ping An Zhongguo, which translates as a peaceful and secure China. Actually, the Politico-Legal Commission, which is the party's big committee in Beijing, the Zhengfawei, which is a party-run organization that oversees all security, police, courts, prosecution in China. Its website is actually now called Ping An Zhongguo. It's actually called China Peace. So according to one report on that website, a Ping An Zhongguo, a peaceful and secure China, is being built one brick at a time through various social governance initiatives. So I'll just talk about a couple of those bricks very, very briefly. As I said, social governance includes a wide range of measures to improve social service provisions through e-governance initiatives. Okay, so it's making it easier for people to access governance services such as health. But like all big tech ambitions across the world, and I'm thinking Amazon here, this data, this social services data, is also being used to build up a picture of individuals' behavior, attitudes, and movements. So Chinese big tech companies like Hikvision, they're selling their wares now to police across the country, and to achieve what is called traceability governance, which helps government officers trace problems with service provisions like sewage problems through AI platforms, but also to help police trace people. So both large and small tech companies sell security equipment, cloud platform integration software, and community monitoring platforms for what's called grid management, which is actual physical monitoring of a particular square of apartments or streets across China. So across China now, every single space is being monitored by these grid workers. Now, they're feeding back information to police-run comprehensive management of public order centres. So they're called Zhongzhiban for short. So there's over 600,000 of these centres now, from the street township level to the province level, and they're now active in aggregating information through these platforms that big tech companies are selling people. So they house systems that carry the potential to realise comprehensive governance by integrating, connecting the data of public security, civil affairs, education, safety, housing, community, all rolled into one through these social governance platforms. All this is to enable the party to be able to see everything. Because if you want to lead over everything, which is what the party wants to do, you've got to see everything. Okay. So China's now just announced also, this is quite interesting, someone told me about this the other day, China's just announced it's going to standardize and unify the health code by 2025, but I think they're going to do it before then. So the health code is now going to become the main ID code, and it's going to be called something like the Digital Smart Medical Surveillance Guard or something like that. It's now, according to authorities, become the integral part of governance, digital governance capacity building. Okay, I better conclude. So in conclusion, we know the party is really great at coming up with fanciful terms like the China dream, okay, which are at best ambiguous, but modernizing governance capacity is not fanciful. It's not ambiguous either. And the party's precisely doing that. It's modernizing its capacity to govern. It's creating this system of comprehensive governance. We're not quite there yet. And I'm not saying that it's a perfect system. It's being created now. It's not actually completely totalized right now. So anyhow, watch out for more variations of this health China ID and secure China and health China and modernizing China, and at the next plenum and beyond. So that's all I want to say. Thanks.
So that was fascinating. Thanks so much. What I'm going to do, so I've got 4 questions here, but coming off some of what Sue has just said, and also just in terms of the other presentations, what I want to do is pose one question to all of you in turn, and then what we might do is come to questions in the Q&A. So I've got some questions in Q&A kind of lined up there, but if there are others that others would like to ask, please add them into the Q&A section, and I'll curate and come to those as we go along. So, I mean, given what Sue's been talking about in terms of the enhancing of political security and creation of a stable, secure society, given what Alice was talking about in terms of the ideological shifts, the inspiration, the idea of kind of inspiring, ensuring struggle, popular mobilization, not quite in a Maoist mode, but in something that's akin to that in a way, given also what Rowan talked about in terms of the attempt to enhance discourse power, narrative power over the world, really, and resist that pressure from abroad, given what Richard talked about in terms of establishing a new political system, one that was without term limits, but also without the factional balancing that we saw in the last 20 years, I suppose, the attempt to try and ensure that that division within the party was avoided by balancing off the various different factions within the party. I guess I want to pose the question to all of you in turn, starting with Rowan. Is she going to succeed or fail over the next 10 years in achieving all of these various different goals? And in answering that question, I'd also like you to just say, well, why do you think he's going to either succeed or fail? So, Rowan, if I can come to you first, and then I'll kind of go through in turn, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience.
Wow. I'm not someone who's keen on betting against Xi Jinping or betting against the party. He's been pretty surprisingly successful to date. Many people were expecting a greater pushback within the party and within society more generally. So he's achieved remarkable success at home to date, but the odds are piling up against that carrying on, in my view. Certainly after we get past the next 5 years into a second term, and because the people appointed to the Politburo Standing Committee, the new ones are over 60 conventionally, they're not liable to be seen as papabile, as potential successors. So it looks like he'll go on for 10 years. How can he stop? It's dangerous to stop. So he'll want to keep going. So after the next 5 years, let's say, I think it's safer to say that I think that these economic problems will pile up that we've been hearing everyone talking about, and the social problems to which Alice especially highlighted will make it increasingly hard for the party to persist, given the level of education in China. This is not Mao China. Education levels are much higher. There's a degree of cosmopolitanness in China. And I think that he's going to come across also exhaustion within his own party. If you read the work report, you'll see that he's piling on further learnings, and people are saying another 80 hours of stuff that party members have to listen to by the end of November. It's we have the Shuishi Changguo app that everyone's got to pile onto every day. So I think that cumulatively, it's going to be quite hard at home for this to keep going. How this will come to an end, I don't know. Richard's someone who has already written persuasively about some ideas about how that may come to an end. Overseas, I think the Belt and Road Initiative has succeeded beyond even expectations in terms of geopolitical geopolitical association. So bringing votes at the UN in support of what China wants it's been very persuasive and effective. But again, increasingly as we go ahead, I said, the banks which are funding this, the Chinese banks, are overladen with expectations. We're seeing that the People's Bank of China has been cleared of top officials in the last few weeks. Maybe because we don't know, there may have been some pushback about the further burdening of debt. And I think that the prospects for continuing down this road past another 5 years certainly are going to be difficult. And China's weaponization, as I described it, of its economic ubiquity is going to become more difficult to realize. And so countries that maybe started to hedge a little bit more towards China, no one's going to choose, China or the US, but countries that kind of have been hedging a bit more towards China may be edging back away from doing that in the next over the next few years. So things will get tougher here on for Xi. We might have seen peak Xi as well as what I described as peak party and peak China economy, things flatlining from here, and it's going to take a lot of resolve. But he is a very resolute figure. He's a true believer, and he really, really believes. He personifies all that's best about the party, and the party personifies all that's best about China. So hard to dislodge, but the pressures will build.
Thank you, Rowan, and I'm sorry for throwing this one to you first and putting you on the spot. But Alice, so have we reached peak Xi, or is there more to come?
I don't know. Is there more to come? I think there's definitely more to come. And I think I've just been thinking about your question. Okay, is Xi going to succeed or fail? I think it just depends on what succeed or fail in what, right? So if you say, all right, Xi Jinping's mission is he saw that the party was in crisis and its grip on China was in crisis. People were questioning, people had Western ideas, people, the party was not sufficiently, secure. The party was not sufficiently secure. So if his goal is to secure the grip of the party and ensure that the regime does not change, I think it's quite likely that, well, I think he has succeeded so far. And I think that as Sue was just talking about, I think China today and the Communist Party today has a whole range of tools that didn't exist in the past, right? And they're combining kind of classic old systems of, mutual monitoring, mutual reporting, that's been around for a long time in China, with a kind of technology, with real-time data gathering and this ability to see into the grassroots in a way that has never been possible before. And I think you can already see, or I've already seen in the last few years, just how impossible it is for, like you can imagine, like if a few years ago, 10 years ago, you said, oh, if people in Shanghai are starving, like they actually don't have enough food, how can the party get away with that and still be just as secure and come out confident and strong and say this was a victory? They can get away with denying Chinese people's reality and saying that didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way you said. Actually, they can kind of flip black and white and turn things upside down in a way that they never could before. And so I think if the goal is, keeping the party in power, I think there's a high chance of success. But if the goal is, as the party claims, the goal is to make China a prosperous nation and to improve the lives of Chinese people, then I think that is in question, right? And I think that also comes down to a question of who do you think was really responsible for the improvement of Chinese lives over the last few decades, right? In the post-Mao era with reform and opening. Was it economic reform? Was it allowing the market to exist? Was it the hard work of Chinese people? And was it opening up China from this micromanagement grip of the party that insists on controlling everything, even your very thoughts? Was it the party stepping back, and people coming forward that brought China wealth and prosperity and this huge change in their lives? Or was it, as Xi says, it was always the party's leadership, and so part of the party is the one that made things great, and so the party is going to keep making things great? I think it depends on, my personal view, of course, is that it was this, the party loosened its grip, and then China has this vitality. It has the people power, and given space, they were able to do all these remarkable achievements. But now we're seeing a reversal. And so I think there is a big question up in the air. And, I think the Chinese government right now, the party believes, that they can kind of have it both ways. They can combine, so Xi always talks about not denying the Mao era or the Deng era. And I think a lot of people pre-Xi were thinking, okay, Mao, that was wrong, that was in the past. And then we have Deng, and now we know which way the economy needs to go. And then Xi is saying, actually, no, we shouldn't reject the Mao era idea of the party leading everything. But at the same, we want to have the party in charge, and we want to have the markets and the openness and the trade. But we want to, combine the two and make this hybrid. And we're not saying that the state sector replaces the private sector, but now the state leads the private sector. So we still have the market, but we also have us setting goals and saying, you need to, for example, I don't know, semiconductors, we're going to go and pour a ton of money in here and raise up our champions. So you have China trying this new hybrid system of new era governance. And the question, I think, is, in terms of regime security, I'm much more hesitant to say, because some people would say, well, if they fail and China's economy, crashes against all these huge problems that have also been building up for decades, like the real estate problem, for example, and suddenly, people are struggling. It's not suddenly, people are already struggling, right? The youth unemployment rate is at an all-time high, and people are not feeling positive about the future. There is this idea that people say, well, if the party's legitimacy is built on improving Chinese lives and their life quality starts to decline, is that a threat to regime stability? I would say not necessarily, because it's not so much about legitimacy. It's more, it's like, on the one hand, there is legitimacy based on improving people's lives, right? And many people in China for a long time now, the last few decades, have been very happy with the way things are, because they feel that, now it's getting richer, they're getting stronger. That's great. But even if that changes, the party also has the coercive tools to make sure that discontent doesn't spread, or you can have many, many pockets of discontent, but everybody is isolated and atomized and cannot connect with anyone else. So I would say the regime has the tools to stay in power. And I don't think that is so much under threat, although you never know. But in terms of, will they succeed in making life better for Chinese people? That is under question. And then just very quickly on the Taiwan question, like, will they succeed in taking Taiwan? And I think that's actually, that's very connected to the other questions. I think that depends quite a lot on what the rest of the world does and how they deter China. And I think the Chinese government's ideal scenario is to take Taiwan without having to fight. And they could do that through a number of ways. They could do it through manipulation of Taiwanese politics in Taiwan. And that's something we'll be watching next year with the presidential elections. Their ideal scenario is, scare Taiwan so much that they just surrender and people don't want to resist. And also to kind of up their leverage to the extent that the rest of the world considers that it's not worth it. It's not worth it to, get in a big fight with China just for the sake of this little island. So I think China is watching, I think they're preparing their military for an invasion scenario, but the best case scenario is you don't need to fight. You can just use your leverage and get the world to cave. And I think if they succeed in that, then well, that's a whole other topic to talk about. But I think that is also possible, and it depends quite a lot on what the Taiwanese government does, what Taiwanese people do, and on what the U.S. and its allies and regional powers decide to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alice. So let me throw my unfair question to you now, Richard.
Right. So what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Yeah, so of course, the truth with these questions is that I can say whatever I like, I can make anything up and nobody will ever hold me to account. First of all, I think I'd agree with Alice to this extent that I think the Communist Party will still be in power. One of the core tenets of the party is there shall be no alternative centers of power. So it's a bit like, you can just, like the Americans did in the Second Iraq War, they disbanded the Iraqi army, but they had to put it back together again because there's simply nobody else who can do the job. The party's attitude is, I can do it and you can't, and because you can't, I will. So it's very hard to see an alternative political organization short of a complete revolution. And frankly, I don't know whether I'd like to see that, because that would be a very bloody event. So I think the party, one way or the other, would still be in power in China. But will China be meeting its objectives to catch up with and surpass the US in nominal GDP terms, to cower Taiwan into submission, to set terms in its relations with other countries? I think that's harder to see, actually. Now, I don't underestimate Chinese determination. I don't underestimate China's ability to invest in all those objectives. I think the thing that I've become more pessimistic about in China is the economy. I've never been a bear on the Chinese economy. I think the officials there are very skilled. They've got a lot of levers to pull, and they've got the energy of a lot of people who really want to make their lives better and get rich. That's been a fantastic combination once the Communist Party got out of the way. And of course, did have some, very clever policy making as well. So, but if you look ahead now, you've got the demographic crunch. I think they lose 120 million workers by 2040. The population is already in decline, even though I don't think the Census Bureau has admitted that yet. You've got a growing elderly population without much of a pension or social safety net. After COVID, China might have a mini brain drain from people who don't want to live under the threat of such restrictions. The productivity the economy needs that individual workers need to exhibit, if you like, to make up for the demographic crunch is no evidence of that on the horizon in China. As I said, the property market has a touch of the Japanese, structural sclerosis about it. It will take many years to work that out of the system. And of course, it can't bounce back too much because there's simply not the, younger people coming on board to buy new apartments. The growth gains that China gets from urbanization, they're dissipating, and they're not coming back either. Externally, I think, China is, I don't know whether I spoke about this today, but, China is not isolated in any fashion, in the global south, in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America. Some people in Australia sloppily talk about China being isolated because of its behavior. I don't think it is. It's only isolated within the Anglosphere and a few other countries. But having said that, I think its poor relations with developed rich countries are a problem with it. I don't think it can dictate terms to them as it thought it might. Those countries are joining together now to balance China. So there's genuine contest. Without libeling Hugh White, the sort of strategic fatalism that he exhibits, that China is going to win, so get used to it, I don't think is necessarily true. I think the US political system has got big problems, but the US economy seems kind of divorced for that and charges along anyway at a reasonable clip. So I don't necessarily see by the end of the next 10 years that China will have become this overwhelmingly powerful military, political, economic force in the world that it can simply get its way. So we often, we get a lot of essays about how, about the Americans' domestic dysfunction and domestic problems. I think that you can make the same case about China. China will also be facing a highly unstable and difficult to manage domestic front as well, particularly if the economy starts growing at a new growth rate of somewhat 3 to 4%, which is not the end of the world, by the way. If you grow 4% in a different way, that's fine. But China is used to much higher levels of growth. And so if you get permanently lower levels of growth, then that's a whole new set of problems you've got to manage because you haven't got all that money to give away anymore.
Thank you so much, Richard. So Sue, I'm going to come to you last. Is Xi Jinping going to succeed in this effort to create this peaceful, stable, surveilled, party-dominated society?
Okay. I'm not going to be saying yes, success, or yes, failure. Just a couple of more things to consider on top of what Richard and the other speakers are saying. I get the sense there's a sense of optimism in the Xi with Xi at the moment, after he has cleared the way in the 20th Party Congress for there not to be any faction. So he's spent the last decade being hampered, if you will, by people in other factions. That doesn't exist anymore. So, if I was him, I'd be going, right, okay, now I've got the space to do what I want. So I think there's an enormous optimism with Xi at the moment. But there are things that he can't predict and can't control, and that is the global economy and the recession and how China's going to react to that. And I think that the fact that he has been, or the party's been deliberately moving away from this discourse of economic prosperity being the sole basis of the party's legitimacy, to this idea that security is the basis of the party's legitimacy now. Okay, then they're on stronger ground there, because you can always say that no matter what's happening economically, that China would not be able to survive without the security system that's in place, that the party's in charge of. I don't think there is, given what I've been saying about the Ping'an Zhongguo project, it's becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to organise collective action in China. So any kind of collective action against the party is not going to be, I don't think it's going to be organised, it's going to be spontaneous. It's going to be people just going, I'm sick of being locked up under COVID, and then in a couple of days time calming down. Because how are you going to organise collective action with the regime as it is, the security regime with it as it is now? So that's basically all I have to say. I'm not a very, I'm sorry, I can't say success or failure, but I think it's becoming more securitized. I don't know what that means in terms of success or failure. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant, thanks, Sue. Okay, so I'm going to move now into some of the questions that we've got, and some of them are to specific speakers. So I'm going to pitch them to the speakers in the last sort of 20 minutes that we've got left. Richard, I'm going to come to you first, because we've got a couple of questions about the domestic governance of China and sort of intra-party dynamics. So yes, it's a black box. Yes, it's very difficult to know what's happening. But one attendee has asked the question, well, what if these loyalists with which she has surrounded himself are not kind of your standard incompetent cronies in authoritarian regimes, but instead they're competent loyalists? Would they be able to be more candid with the top boss and potentially therefore improve the responsiveness and adaptiveness of the government? And I've also got a question here which says, well, what do you see as the big mistakes that have been made? Because you mentioned some mistakes have been made. So first one, what if the loyalists actually enhance the quality of government? And the second one is, well, what are the mistakes that have been made?
Well, I guess that's true. I mean, if we call them competent cronies, but it's very hard for me to distinguish any of them on any particular issues from Xi in a very clear way in areas where they might take him on. So yeah, absolutely. I think that they may be able to be more open. We don't have total insight into their personal, professional relationships, so that's why I'm a little bit cautious. But it's very hard if you're going to get to the top and you haven't distinguished yourself on any sort of policy issue. Then it's pretty late to start now, and pretty dangerous to start now, particularly when you rely on a single patron. So, they can all give clever tactical advice on different issues, but I don't know how else. I mean, they have been chosen because she wants an all shoulders to the wheel approach. Everybody's got to get with the program, and they're the ones to execute and enforce that. They're not there to come up with different ideas. Secondly, so what mistakes has China made? We all make mistakes, big and little ones, every day. But let me just give two ones that I think are big mistakes lately. I think the throwing out succession process is a big mistake, because now that adds a genuine element of instability. And if she were to pass away or become no longer competent mentally as a leader or something like that, like Brezhnev or something, then you potentially have what the party fears most, and that is a split at the top of the party as people rush to fill the vacuums. The succession process worked well. The idea that only Xi can manage China, I think, is the kind of fantasy that a lot of authoritarian leaders have. They start to think that they embody the state and all its ambitions and capabilities, and I think that's obviously wrong. So I think that's the first mistake. And the second mistake, I think, is, and perhaps we're seeing a winding back of this now, is the wolf warrior diplomacy stuff. And that is, maybe China doesn't care. There's an element of China that thinks that, we're rising, you're falling, suck it up, we don't care what you think. Okay, maybe, I doubt it. But let me give you one particular example close to home, and that is Japan, which I wrote a book about China and Japan. Now, there's always been in Japan, for many different reasons, a strong sort of Sino-centric sort of faction, if you like, or Sino-centric leanings. The idea of Asia for Asians. Why shouldn't Asia be run by Asians? Of course, why not? But you've seen that really sort of almost die away or become a great minority in Japan because of Chinese behavior. Now, if China wants to get rid of the US from Asia, or be the most dominant power in Asia, which it clearly does, and there's nothing surprising about that, they kind of want the US to go into bourgeois decline on the other side of the Pacific, while they take their rightful place once again at the heart of the region. All China had to do was to basically seduce Japan, be nice to Japan, flatter Japan, do Japan favors, just stay away from the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands for a little bit, change their rhetoric and the like. Not every time that Japan pops its head up and roll out the history weapon, heavy weapons again. There's a lot for China to commemorate there. I'm not denying that. But if China had, I think, huge chance to shift Japan out of the US column or minimize it, and in fact, they've done the opposite. And of course, people forget Japan is America's biggest biggest single US ally, military ally. There's more US troops in Japan than any other single country. If they could have unwound Japanese support for America, if they could have made Japan feel safe, secure, then America would be finished in Asia. And they're singularly incapable of doing that because of the role that Japan plays in internal Chinese politics. So that's two errors.
Thank you, Richard. And that takes me very neatly on to the next question. So Atul Kumar has asked the question about how does the call for struggle in the domestic polity and the ideological mobilization, all of those sorts of things, how is that likely to affect China's relationships with its immediate neighbors? Now, Atul, I'm gonna just add it. Atul's probably asking in terms of relationship with India, which we haven't mentioned, where I actually think there are similar dynamics to the things that Richard has just described in terms of the relationship with Japan. So can I maybe come to Rowan, and then I'll come to Alice on this question, please? So do you think there's a prospect here where that Xi's regime will, attempt to divert attention from some of the domestic issues, I suppose, with foreign policy adventurism towards India, Japan, Southeast Asia, so on and so forth? Rowan.
Divert attention to an extent. But as I started my remarks, everything falls back on domestic policy within China. It's quite hard, despite this. Everyone's been talking about, and I've talked about as well, this move to look again for legitimacy from the security standpoint as opposed to the economy standpoint. It's easier done rhetorically than it's done effectively in terms of shifting how people think within China. And I think that while the government does, of course, control the discourse within China pretty effectively, and we know that it's very hard for any outside voices to get in, and in fact, it's quite hard now for foreign journalists to even be based within China and writing about China from the outside world. And there's three of us on this Zoom session who've done that work in the past. So I think that it's going to be quite easy for the internal discourse to be controlled. Just how convincing it's going to be, I'm not so sure. I think the kind of hip pocket thing does matter more. And, as Alice was talking about, how people perceive zero COVID working out in their neighborhood, those kind of things will continue to matter more. And short of an actual war, this kind of belligerent rhetoric will have some effect in elite politics within the party, but I'm not sure how well it plays out amongst the 1.4 billion. And we see, for example, the kind of rhetoric in the no limits agreement between China and Russia. You kind of expect that Chinese people, again, high curation of what they are told about the Ukraine war, there to be a greater degree of excitement about Russia's role and so on. But of course, that's difficult to achieve because it's not exactly great Russian victories, but nevertheless, a greater degree of buy-in to that. Xi has called Putin my best, most intimate friend and so on. So we'd expect if the geopolitical is going to play bigger in the landscape in China, you'd expect that kind of thing to really be seizing people. I don't think it's going to happen. Now, with India particularly, China has certainly tended, during the 2 times I lived in Beijing, to kind of hardly mention India at all. So it wasn't really mentioned. For India, China looms large as a problem and a puzzle. And you yourself, Ian, I know, have recently been in India, and you could talk much more effectively than I think the rest of us can on that particular topic. Certainly, the idea that India, as it becomes more populous than China, can kind of assume a bigger regional role, let alone a global role than China, would be immensely shocking to Chinese people, and kind of unlikely, but it's not impossible. And within our region, yes, China is not a total pariah. Of course not. It's nothing like USSR during that Cold War. It's immensely and comprehensively engaged with all our countries in terms of people and economy and so on. So there's the disengagement isn't really going to happen. The struggling China is going to be more clearly observed by the rest of us because of that level of engagement. And so I think the China in the world as the new source of legitimacy, it's clearly there. It's clearly what's being pushed. I'm not really convinced that it's going to work in the way that the party would like.
Thanks, Rowan. Alice, can I come to you on this question about that kind of domestic politics, foreign policy linkage that Rowan highlighted at the beginning there, and this issue about these very tense and difficult relationships with some of the neighbors. We've got about sort of 10 or so minutes left, and I want to squeeze in one question about the Pacific as well. So, Alice.
Okay, so keep it short. I mean, I would just very quickly, I would say, to me, it's very clear from my last few years living in China that as the domestic situation in China gets more difficult to manage. So when people's lives are getting more difficult, when the economy is slowing down and people are suffering, China dials up the nationalism. And I saw that in a very intense way over the last 3 years, because in the beginning of that was the Trump era, and then it was COVID, and then there was a sense, because every day on the daily news and the Xinwen Lianbao at 7 p.m., you know, there was a very dramatic shift in China where there was this sense of, you know, the world is against us. Australia is calling for an investigation into COVID origins, and like all these Western countries, Mike Pompeo is a pig. Like I remember, like I would hear my neighbor blasting the Xinwen Lianbao, and it would be like Hua Chunying ranting about Mike Pompeo in our compound. And so there is this sense of I think that the propaganda authorities are trying to foster this sense of nationalism and this sense of everybody is out to get us and we need to fight back against them. And they're really, really dialing that up in China. And they're also giving more of a platform to Chinese nationalists online, you know, censoring the moderate voices, calling for pragmatic behavior and really lifting up the wolf warriors. And I think on the ground that did change the sense, you know, there was this rising sense of hostility towards foreigners and particularly towards Westerners that I also experienced. But I think that that is a domestic strategy. That is a domestic strategy of distraction. But as for the question of will China actually start real conflicts, I think that's where we have to be careful, and that's not so clear. And even when you look at the Pelosi visit to Taiwan earlier this year, Chinese people were really angry because they had been drinking the Kool-Aid of strong China that can do, you know, stop other countries from doing things they don't like, you know, for the last few years. And you could see this huge nationalist reaction when Pelosi was able to land in Taiwan, and Chinese people, nationalist Chinese people were saying, like, why, you know, like, why didn't we do more? I thought we were going to shoot her plane, you know. So I think there is this kind of overblown sense within China in the last few years of we are wolf warriors and we, China can do what it wants because that's what they're getting from the state media and the propaganda bodies. But in terms of what China actually does, I don't think China wants a conflict. And I do think that they are realizing that this kind of wolf warrior foreign policy and diplomacy I agree that it has backfired it's kind of an own goal. So we would say like it has hurt them, and we might be seeing a recalibration of that. So whether that means that they will then also tune down the nationalism at home, I'm not sure about that. But I do think that at the policy level and in terms of it's clear that China has realized, okay, we want to stabilize. We want to stabilize our environment, and that they're not willing to actually go and make conflicts just to distract people at home, although they can keep distracting with lots of talk about it.
Thanks, Alice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so look, we've got a couple of questions here just about the Pacific. I'm going to sort of put them together and then we might run through everybody in turn just for a last word. So the question here really is, given China's domestic economic slowdown, given with the well-known problems in the banking system, the kind of the capital lack of availability, increasing lack of availability of capital and so on, what does that imply for China's engagement with regions like the Pacific? And we might also add on with countries like Australia as well. So I'll go in turn. So I'll come to you, Rowan, then Alice, then Richard, then Sue, if for final thoughts, given that we've only got a couple of minutes left. So Rowan first.
Well, the slowdown least affects what's happening in the Pacific, I think, because you don't need to spend so much money to gain some impact there. And it's an area of obvious neglect by the rest of the world, even though through these decades, the Pacific has been recipient of highest per capita aid. And governments in the Pacific have disappointed their own voters in terms of provision of services. So there's big disappointment there. And I think people are not too fast, although they're not great fans of big Chinese involvement because they see Chinese workers brought in to build roads and things that they think quite rightly they can do themselves. Nevertheless, people are not too fussed that it's China that's doing that. So the idea that we think that keeping China out is something that is appealing to Pacific Islanders, that's not really the case. They don't feel concerned about their own security in those terms. They're really looking for better lives. And so China's not going to pull out from the degree of engagement it's already achieved in the region. It's up to, I think, countries like Australia to find better ways, whole of government or whole of Australia ways to engage more effectively than it has done through the so-called reset in the past. And I think the Pacific will continue to benefit from playing off one against the other. It's going to be Africa also is another area of a whole continent, bigger picture in terms of money, potential involvement of private sector and so on, but not dissimilar pictures. And questions of how much our major companies going to get involved as well, and our universities are going to put resources into those regions, and reciprocal arrangements and knowledge of those regions is going to be important.
Thank you, Rowan. Alice, over to you for your minute or so.
Okay, I can't really speak to the Pacific Islands if that's what we're talking about, because I haven't reported from there. So I would defer to Australian colleagues who know more about it. But I would just say very quickly in terms of the competition between China and the US for influence among developing countries. One thing I see is that the Biden administration, they're working very hard on strengthening alliances, but I think from developing countries' perspectives, there's this question of, okay, the US talks a lot about security, they talk a lot about ideology, but where are the economic carrots, if you will? Where is the investment? Where is the access to, where are the trade deals? I think there's a lot more that the US could be doing outside of just saying, this is a fight for democracy, or saying, you should also understand that China is a security threat. They need to offer more benefits to developing countries.
Thanks, Alice.
Yeah.
Richard, over to you. Sorry, Richard, you're on mute.
Sorry. Belt and Road lending in general has fallen off a cliff since 2017 all around the world. The word Belt and Road has become a bit of a meaningless term. It used to be through Central Asia and Southeast Asia. Now you've got it one day in Argentina, the next day in Antarctica, the next day in Nigeria. It's become a byword for investment. It's gone down everywhere. You can only build a $10 billion, lend Laos $10 billion to build a railway once. You can't spend $40 billion in Pakistan, every day. So what is happening now is being bedded down. In the Pacific, it's the same story. I don't think there's been a big, large loan since 2015, 2016. But as Rowan says, you don't need to spend much in the Pacific to make your mark. And secondly, but having said that, these countries no longer have the capacity to borrow. But having said that, China is still active in the Pacific, in the Solomon Islands and Kiribati, the two countries which they displaced Taiwan from in recent years. And for example, they're equipping the the Solomon Islands police with weapons, etc., and training. That's not a lot of money, but it potentially has a big impact. So I think the great game, or the contest, whatever, however you want to see it, is going to continue apace. I think the one country to really watch from the Australian perspective and in Southeast Asia, where China is putting a lot of effort and money into, is Indonesia. Indonesia's focus under Jokowi is all about development. They shy away from the big geopolitical questions. And if you want a development partner, then it's hard to go past China. So I think that's the really interesting one.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And for what little I know, I absolutely endorse that view. Sue, I know you're not a foreign policy person, but I'm going to give you the last minute or so for any reflections that you may have on the conversation.
Sorry, someone's trying to ring me. I actually don't want to add any comments about the Pacific, because it's not in my area, but yeah, great responses from the other three speakers. So not necessary for me to add anything, but thanks, Ian.
Thank you. Look, it's been a real pleasure for me as a non-China person in particular, but as somebody who tries to watch the region as much as I possibly can, to have four such distinguished, knowledgeable, articulate speakers today. I know this has been a very long session, but it's been a very engaging. We've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm really grateful to all of you for joining us today, and also really grateful for the audience. We've had a number of fantastic questions. I know we haven't got to all of them. I'd just like to then thank you four, also the audience, and I'd like to thank the team, Megan and Kelsey with the Griffith Asia Institute for the great work that they've done in supporting this today. So thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off now, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.